Too often in podcasting, we lie to ourselves that this is all new. It's brave new world. Well, I've seen in life that things are more evolutionary than revolutionary. And if we look back on what worked at previous platforms, we can see what will work in this one. And today we're so honored to have Chris King. He's going to be sitting down with Chloe Williamson, talking about the lessons he learned from AM radio and how it applies to podcast interviews. It's a great, interesting take on it. And I think whether or not you grew up on AM radio or not, you'll listen to this and say, this makes a whole lot of sense. I'm going to try it in my next podcast interview.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us today. Can you share with me a bit of your background and a good story about how you got where you are today?
Oh, wow.
Starting off big.
Right. So there's a lot of stories. That's all right. Well, a little bit about my background. I have a history of making seemingly impossible things happen because I got to a point where I just didn't care about all the reasons that were perfectly logical and absolutely correct that they couldn't happen. And, as one example, when I was 21, I decided I wanted to be an NCAA ice hockey player. And there were only two things standing in my way. Number one, I was failing out of my junior college. And number two, I had never skated before. But fast forward 18 months, I was leading the team into the state championships. And granted, it was Division II, so it wasn't like super high level. But still, there's what I learned later is that there's a science to making the seemingly impossible a reality. And now that's what we do for our clients.
Okay. So in your experience, how would you say, what are the differences between podcast hosts versus other media professionals, such as like radio DJs or television personalities? How are hosts different?
For podcast hosts, generally, most of them are awful.
Okay.
Because they're not trained. I mean, yes, they have the software and the hardware and everything they need, but they don't have the concepts. They don't understand. In a former life, I was an AM, FM radio broadcaster, and I used to train the talent. And so there are a lot of tricks and hooks and things that really set apart a host, particularly when it comes to interviews. There are so many podcasts that feature interviews, and most people don't know what the elements of a good interview are or how to construct them.
So how do you think is the best way to approach a host differently than you would, again, other media professionals, if you were looking into guesting, that is?
Yeah, step one is you got to be relevant to their audience. I mean, that's the first thing is like, do your research, make sure that it's the right fit, make sure that that you have something valuable for the listener. It's it's sort of going through the host to the listener.
So what are some strategies that you have found effective in approaching hosts? Obviously, you do podcast guesting. What is your best approach to getting on those shows?
Catering to the ego works really well. This was true. Yeah, this was true back in the radio days too, is that everybody wanted to be on the air back in the day and when radio was king. And so I would tell all the wannabe jocks, I said, look, send your demo to the program director with the specific idea of getting their feedback. Say, hey, I love your station. You're so good at what you do. Will you provide me some feedback? Because if you're just reaching out being like, I want to be on the air, it's like, well, no shit. Everybody wants to be on the air. So the idea is to find the ways to make yourself as good as possible and to get the attention of an actual host. Say, look, here's what I love about your show. Here's what I love about you as a host. And I'd love your feedback on this or something like that. But catering to the ego in some way, shape, or form can be very effective.
Okay. And what are some mistakes you have found that people make when trying to approach a host, other than just strictly not feeding to the ego? What other mistakes can be made?
Well, I would think it starts with kind of an energy. What can you do for the host? What can you do to contribute to their goals, their agenda, their show? Obviously especially if they have a significant listening audience, there's a lot that they can potentially do for you. Well, what can you do for them? You've sort of come with this give to give mentality, not even a give to get mentality, but what can I do to support their success? How can I make this great for them?
Perfect. So what's some advice you would give to someone who wants to maximize the impact of their podcast guesting? So feeding to the ego is great to get on and adding value is great for the interview, but how can they move it even further than that?
be really good on the air.
So what's good to you, Chris? Tell us.
Yeah, and this is where I'm going to be. I could potentially be a hypocrite here, but that doesn't necessarily make me wrong.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like
We offer all advice.
talking way too much. It's like nobody's listening after 30, 45 seconds. Keep your answers, tight. Keep it to the point. Stay on point. Try not to go down the rabbit holes too much. Give people enough information so that it's valuable and they can understand, but not so much that you're teaching them, when they want to know what time it is, you're telling them how to build a watch.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. So how can guests tailor their message to fit the unique format of each podcast? Obviously, they need to listen to it to get an idea, but how can the personal touch be there?
It's a slippery slope, because while you do want to, I get very careful with the word cater.
Okay.
I would say be relevant to their audience and maintain your brand and in an authentic way. Authenticity is everything. And so, we all know when we're being sold, we all know when we're being catered to or something, or coddled, and that typically doesn't feel very good. So you have to find that perfect balance of authenticity, maintaining your brand, and making it relevant as opposed to catering to. Because if you go into self-betrayal there, it's going to be a slippery slope.
So speaking of balance, because that actually ties in very nicely to my next question, I was going to ask how preparation can play in delivering a compelling podcast appearance, because there also tends to be a fine line between over preparing and kind of not having natural answers to questions. So what kind of preparation do you like to do? How do you tread that line?
Yeah, again, this is where I'm a terrible hypocrite, because I I tend to be very extemporaneous. I can't remember the last time I really prepped for something. Even in my radio days, it used to drive my program directors crazy, because they'd be like, "You can't open the mic not knowing what you're going to say." I'm like, "Yeah, I really can." So I can and I will. But I don't know that you can over prepare. You definitely you want to sound conversational, and you want to sound very present in the moment, right? So if it's not conversational, if it sounds rehearsed, if it sounds scripted, if it sounds like you're reading from a script, you're going to lose the authenticity piece. The easiest way to do this, I think, one tool, I'm all about tools, is speaking directly to the host, or imagining one single person who is of their target audience, right? Like their perfect avatar of their listener, and talk to that one person. The reason being is that you could have 10,000, 100,000 people listening to you, but if you imagine you're only speaking to one person, every one of those 10,000, 100,000 people feel like you're talking directly to them. So, it's coming from that, instead of imagining that you're on a stage somewhere. And again, depending on what's relevant to the podcast, if instead of, imagining you're on a stage or you're on a broadcast, imagining you're sitting there having a cup of coffee, and make it very conversational.
Okay. So what are some trends that you're observing in the podcasting world that you think professionals should be aware of, whether they're hosts or guests? What do you think?
I mean, it's kind of the Wild West still, everybody can do anything, whatever they want, right? So I would say that there really are no rules. I would say, don't try to be the next someone, or don't try to, as opposed to trying to be like this person, even if they're doing really well, be the first you instead of the next them.
Okay, more authenticity. That seems to be the key word here today. I love it. So you mentioned earlier that you have tons of stories. Well, I want to hear one. What has been your most memorable experience as a podcast guest, good or bad? Anything you got?
Wow. The basic things, I'll start with the bad, I guess. The basic things like audio quality, internet speeds, like make sure your tech works. Like that's when the tech doesn't work, if make sure when even with the host, make sure that they're hearing you loud and clear. If something sounds overmodulated, that you can't fix that. It's not a question of just lowering the volume. Overmodulation creates a distortion. Garbage in, garbage out. Nobody's going to listen to bad audio. So that has to be number one. And you can get good audio pretty easily. I mean, for the cost of $100 or even less, you get a pretty decent microphone these days. I think, let's see, as far as good experiences, it's the right fit. It boils down to fit. What is on brand for me? I tend to be my company. We're edgy, we're irreverent. So things that are a little on the edgier side, we can certainly straddle the line and still maintain a level of professionalism, because we do deal with a pretty sophisticated client. But yeah, I think making sure that they feel like your people.
Okay. I love that. It's the personal touch, right? That's what we say here too. So if you could give just one piece of advice, and you could make it as long of a piece of advice as you want, but if you could just give one piece of advice to someone considering podcast guesting, what would you tell them? What's the most important thing they need to know?
I think it comes down to strategy. A lot of we saw this a lot back in the day. Everybody said, oh, when Facebook became big, it's like, we got to get on Facebook, and now podcasting, but we got to have a podcast. Why? Like slow it down here a little bit. Yes, it is a very popular medium. Yes, it does make sense for a lot of people. Does it make sense for you? There's a great story, and I think it was Lamborghini. They said, somebody asked them, why don't you advertise on social media? Lamborghini said, our clients are not doom scrolling on social media. So while yes, it might be wildly successful, and yes, it might be this incredible medium, and yes, it might be fantastic, but does it really make sense for you? I would also say that there's probably a measurable level of honesty that needs to take place. Are you good on camera, on air? Because if you're not, you're going to do yourself more damage than you are good.
Especially if you have a talk too much gene, being on camera never helps that, ever, ever, ever.
I look, word economy is not a gift I naturally possess.
I constantly have to tell myself in our team meetings, like, shut up, because I just know I'm taking up everyone's time so much. So yeah, the brevity is that's a good tip.
Especially when you know and love your stuff. When you know and love your stuff, you're going to want to talk about it all day and go away all the rabbit holes and everything. Keep it tight, keep it simple. And remember that even with podcasts, I think this is a little less true with podcasts than it was with radio. But what we used to say in radio was, everybody's listening with half an ear. This is why when they buy ad space, they buy these massive amounts of inventory, because it's going to take 3 months of constant on-air play before anybody actually hears it. Now, it's probably a little better with podcasting because people are selecting in and opting into this. But you got to make sure that you can give it to somebody in a digestible way when they're walking down the street or in their car or whatever. So if you start talking about quantum mechanics or something, which I might, I got to remember where my audience might be in that moment.
Okay, good. Also in the car a lot. I have to remember that. I can't get too lofty on things because people are literally driving down the street. So what are some upcoming projects, initiatives, or anything that you're excited about that our listeners should know about? Pitch yourself now. What you got? What you got coming for us?
Well, I've recently been given the directive that I have to write another book. So
lucky us. That's
right. My marketing people are like, you have to write another one. I'm like, really? so that's on the board right now. We have our own podcast, which of course which is kind of a voyeuristic kind of thing. It's we're doing one-on-one coaching sessions, just one-off sessions with people, and it's pretty deep, it's pretty intense. And I sort of joke about this, but our guests cry a lot because it does get pretty intense.
Authentic.
Right? It's very authentic, and it's amazing. I tell you, it's amazing how willing people are to not just go to that level of depth, but to share that with an audience with the idea or hopes that it'll benefit somebody else, because there's so much of the same stuff that we're all working on in terms of, personal relationships, in terms of work issues. And it could be the tactical stuff, efficiency, time management thing, or it could be something really deep, kind of deep-seated subconscious psychology that's train wrecking your life. And so, so that's pretty high focus for us right now.
I love that. So where can our audience find you in the meantime? I would love for all of them to find out about your work and connect with you if they need to. So what's some socials? What you got?
Thank you so much. Yes, you can find everything is at the Chris M. King. The website is chrismking.com, and everything is there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I told you it wasn't going to be too hard. So that's all we got today. And we'll give it back to you, Tom.
Well, there you have it. Some great pearls from history and AM radio that you can use as you go on your next podcast interview. You want to engage people. You want to educate people. You want to keep their attention. All of those things that people did in AM radio and you're going to do on podcast interviews.